we're going. Thanks so much to this week's hosting group. Absolutely fantastic. Really, really good job done there. And especially since you were the first group, I know that's always a bit daunting. So I'm very impressed. Thank you so much for that. Thanks also for posting your great discussion posts already. I can see some really interesting conversations emerging. Personally, I'm really enjoying the replies that you guys are giving to each other's ideas. Really great discussions happening there about the differences between leaders and managers, the role of personality in leadership, and absolutely this week's discussion about leadership from your hosting group. So well done. Definitely keep those coming. This lecture is going to be digging more deeply into what we mean by leadership, and we'll also be looking at the idea of implicit leadership, which I'll get into very, very shortly. Before we get started, though, I just want to ask you something, and a little warning, I'm going to move super quickly today because I really want to try and leave some time for Q&A at the end. So please forgive me if I'm speaking quickly, but it's for that purpose. So before I get started, let me ask you a question. Who is your favorite superhero? And what leadership quality do they have that you value? Let's do a chatterful. So just type into the chat your favorite superhero and the quality, the leadership quality they have that you value. When you're ready, type it in. Oh, nice, Spider-Man. Truthfulness, selflessness, empathy, humility, being down to earth. Yeah, lots of honesty coming up. Yes, okay. Strong females. Great. I love that. All right, keep them coming. And everybody else who wants to look in the chat, please do, because there's some really nice ones there. So these qualities that you just listed might be a leadership quality that you already have, or maybe just that you aspire to, which is also fine. When we see things in others, sometimes it's because we recognize them in ourselves. Now, you might be closer to your favorite superhero than you think with that in mind. So before we get started, just a few reminders. This course moves incredibly fast, so it's really important to get on top of a couple of things. So remember that your reflective journals are due by Sunday evening. So please ensure that you've written in your journal for this week, and make sure, really sure that you keep a copy for yourself, because once you press enter and it goes through, you won't be able to read it again. So make sure you keep that copy so that at the end of semester, you can read through and write your summary at the end. Hosting groups. If you haven't joined a hosting team, you need to go and do that as soon as you can. All the links are there on Canvas. Get onto that now. I'm encouraging all groups to start organizing where they're going to have most of their communication. So whether that's through Canvas initially, or I would then advise you to move off Canvas, up to you, but there are really big groups this year. So you just think about different ways you can manage the workload. Think of innovative ways that you can contribute, and make sure everybody in the group's contributing. That's really part of this task here. Make sure as well that you contact me at least 2 weeks before your session to get the speaker details. I don't want 3 people contacting me, so just that's part of your organization together, is to set up the liaison person. So make sure that you do that. That's a great demonstration of leadership here. And of course, for your leadership practice, start thinking about your leadership practice now. Remember, you need to get 5 weeks of that in. So really important to start as soon as you can. And the last thing that's also really important is the complex problem solving. Now, last week I told you, don't worry about writing the assignment yet. Please don't do that. But I do want everyone to start signing up to the Navigating Complexity resources. It's really good to get onto this early, because next week, sorry, not next week, the week after, Jane McMaster is the person, she'll be talking about that. And so that's going to be really important to get onto it. So sign up to it now. Really, really important. And the discussion board, obviously, you have to contribute to those discussion boards each week in order to get the full marks. I hate thinking about marks because I want this to be about your development, but that is really important. I'm seeing, as I said, really beautiful things going up there. So Just make sure that you're contributing at least once a week between Monday and Sunday. And then, of course, attendance is expected at all the seminars. If you're not going to make it for any reason, please send me an email so that I can take note of that. And that's all the boring stuff for today. Let's get into the content. So to begin, we've got to question leadership a little bit and look at this area of what we call implicit leadership. And then we're going to talk about some useful ideas and some theories to get you started. And then we've got a few key questions that you can use for your own personal development based on today's content. So when we think about leadership, we often have very, very different perspectives, and that's coming through on the discussion board, to be honest. We may assume that leadership at the top's a bit easy, right? You get to kick back, put your hands behind your head, and just relax a little bit, let everyone else do the work. Now, for some, that might be true. Leadership can mean different things to each and every one of us, and our perception of leadership is often shaped by the early experiences of other leaders. So depending on the culture and the context we're raised in, our perceptions of leaders around us really varies. Even from the nursery rhymes we've been exposed to and the stories we've been read as children, to what Hollywood has helped us think about through films that we watch and TV shows, for example, we often have implicit assumptions about what leadership is. So we're going to do an exercise now. I'm going to get you to tap into some of your own implicit leadership understandings, theories, or perspectives. I'm going to flash up images, 5 seconds each, that's it, of different leaders. And I want you to write down the first 1 or 2 words. That's all, just 1 or 2 words that comes to mind when you think about this person as a leader. Now, don't think too much. I just want you to write down the first word or 2. This is an activity. You don't have to share the words. This is just for you. Some of these leaders may have passed. Some of them are still alive. Some of them you may not consider leaders. Some of them you may not even know who they are. That's okay. Just write a little question mark if that's the case. Some of these leaders are in politics, business, science, STEM, entertainment. Now, it's best to do this with a pen and paper because I'm going to be going through them really, really quickly, and it's much easier than typing. So I'd always encourage you, as I said last week, to bring pen and paper to these seminars because you want to be able to take notes quickly. All right, and we're going to go really quickly to tap into your implicit assumptions. You ready? Let's do it. 5 seconds per image, 1 or 2 words. Benjamin, can you just pop yourself on mute? All right. We're not going to dig into this too deeply, but I want you to look at the words that you wrote down and see if you can identify any pattern or theme. Do you tend to focus on things like the contribution made to society, the impact of others, or the impact on others, the form of interaction that they use? Maybe you're noticing you're writing down whether you like them or you dislike them, whether they're friendly or unfriendly. Are there adjectives like that that you can see? Can you identify a certain pattern or theme that comes up for you when you're thinking about leadership, no matter who that leader is? So we're looking for themes here. This can be a glimpse of your underlying implicit leadership ideals. Now, this is just a little trick, right? It doesn't come out of specific research, but what it does, it helps us to tap into some of our unconscious biases around how we think about leadership, and perhaps tap into some of the assumptions that we make about leadership through our own lens of the world. Now, if we tap into that, then we can start to understand where our blind spots might be and how we might develop our understanding of our own implicit assumptions around leadership so that we can be informed in more useful ways to help us become the leaders that we want to become. The other questions you might start to ask yourself is a couple here, and this may be good for your journal as well. What significant experiences have shaped your view of leadership? And what are the patterns of thinking or beliefs that you hold about yourself as a leader that might have been informed by these experiences? These are really key questions to keep asking yourself as we move through this program. So now we're going to dive into some leadership theory. Now, there are many different theories of leadership. In fact, in our Coaching Psychology's Masters unit, we spend one whole day just on the stuff I'm going to talk about today. So we obviously have a lot less time than that. We're going to cover 3 leadership theories very briefly, and we're just going to pick out some of the juicy bits so that you can start broadening your perspectives on leadership. So remember last week we looked at some of these theories and movements across the history of leadership. So if we look at these as well as some newer theories, we can basically break leadership theories down into 5 core types. So the first 3 are focused on the leader, traits, behavioral, and contingency or situational. Remember that trait theories hold the idea that we're born with a certain leadership trait, or that we might be able to develop traits to be good leaders. Behavioral theories of leadership focus on the behaviors of individuals, how we act as leaders, the actual observable behavior of a leader. Now, you can have a trait of a certain type, like honesty, but that doesn't necessarily mean it translates into behavior, right? They can be related, but not necessarily. So in terms of categories, that's why they're distinct here. The contingency or situational leadership theories look at how leaders show up in certain situations or contexts. So when they're under pressure or when they're in an emergency, like we're dealing with now in Queensland and New South Wales, or when they're collaborating with a large group, what sort of leadership is needed for each type of situation? And how does the leader vary in their response based on the situation? So these 3 approaches tend to focus wholly on the leader. Leadership is just about the individual, how they were born, what traits they have, what their behavior is, and how they show up in different situations. The next cluster of leadership theories are those that we define as being relational. So relational theories of leadership focus on the interaction between leaders and followers. So one example of this, which we're not going to cover in this course, so I won't go into too much detail, is called Leader-Member Exchange Theory, or LMX. And this theory focuses on the quality of the individual relationships between a leader and each of their followers. It suggests that when leaders provide attention to certain individuals, then those individuals can contribute more to their organizational space and in turn tend to get rewarded more. So these relational theories are interactional. It's about what happens between a leader and a follower, or a leader and a group, or a leader and an organization. not just necessarily what's within that individual leader. And then we've got emergent. This is the last category. And it's more of a recent approach to leadership. So these theories really focus on the system. How do the constructs of an environment help certain forms of leadership and those forms of leadership to emerge? Emergent leadership is more about action and occurrence. It's something that happens, right? It's a movement can be a form of leadership, like a gesture. Rebellion can be a form of leadership. Thus, leadership emerges rather than one person simply appointed as the leader and that's it. We can think of leadership here as being a property of the system. So not necessarily embedded in the individual, but embedded in the interactions between the environment, the system, and those individual system members. So here's an idea to contemplate. To be an effective leader is to be an effective communicator. What do you think about that, right? The process of leadership often happens within that interaction. Leadership can't be experienced unless it's impacting another person in some way. It's like the old adage, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around, does it actually make a sound? Same thing. If you express leadership but no one's around to experience it, is it still leadership? Something to ponder on. When we talk about effective communication, we're thinking about communication in a broad sense. So not just having a conversation, but how we express our values, how we contribute to the broader communication or interaction that happens in any organization. And we're going to see some of this in the next two leadership theories. As we go through them, I want you to think about which theories are most relevant to your understanding of leadership right now, and what might be some useful perspectives that help you build your own form of leadership. So one of the most famous and well-researched theories of leadership is that of transformational leadership. And I've seen this come up already a bit on the discussion board. So some people have obviously already got their heads around this. Some people might have heard of it. If you have, great. If you haven't, don't worry. Early versions of transformational leadership were called charismatic leadership. They focus on what's called the 5 I's of leadership, because everything in the list begins with the letter I. Now, some writers only identify 4, but others identify 5. So for the purposes of nuance, we'll be looking at all 5 of those today. So the first up is idealized attributes. This is all about how the leader shows up and how they build trust with others. Transformational leaders tend to deliver on what they promise, and they're authentic about it. They don't just do that thing of, making a rule to under-promise and over-deliver. It's not about impressing people. It's about being authentic. They also exhibit ethical behavior. They tend to put the needs of their followers and their organization above their own. All of these attributes help to build trust. Now, idealized behaviors refers to the actions and behaviors that a leader exhibits to serve as a role model. A transformational leader acts with integrity, so people know how they're going to show up and they respect others' positions. They consistently show up in certain ways. They're not erratic and sort of leaving people guessing who the heck is this person. If they punish certain behaviors, they do that equally, not just to the people they don't like. They do it with integrity. They can approach difficult conversations with respect for the other person, but they also hold people accountable. The third I in this framework refers to inspirational motivation. So transformational leaders inspire others. They tend to talk about their values. They tend to be able to present a vision of what the future could look like and how people can move towards that vision. And that really motivates people into action. Next on the list is intellectual stimulation. So the leader encourages innovative thinking. So they tend to be open to new ideas. They tend to encourage disparate thoughts and differences of opinion. And be able to hold conversations in a way that invites difference and divergence. It's not my way or the highway. And this provides an opportunity for a variety of solutions to emerge, which allows for more creative outcomes. And finally, we have individualized consideration, which is very much related to how we work as executive coaches. And I'm going to be speaking a lot more about this next week when we cover coaching. So transformational leaders focus on the needs and growth areas of individuals. They understand that these are different for each person, and they really pay attention to that. It's not a cookie cutter approach. They focus on the growth of others to get the best out of them for that person's own benefit. It's not, again, it's not self-serving. They genuinely want to help others for their own benefit. So looking at these 5 I's overall, a transformational leader is the type of leader that says, this is what we're doing. This is the big picture. This is why it's important for me and for us collectively. I invite all the ideas of how we get there. You can trust that I'll support you. And when I say I'm going to do something, I will do it. And finally, I'll pay attention to what each person needs, and I'll help you flourish as we move forward together. And that's basically what transformational leadership in practice looks like. Now, I want to compare this with some other leadership theories that you will probably see and have probably seen and will probably recognize even in the world today. The first is something called transactional leadership. And it's all about transaction between the leader and the follower. So we can break this down even further into 2 categories. Contingent reward occurs when the leader rewards achievement. And management by exception is where they monitor for mistakes. So it's that classic carrot or the stick mentality, leading people by focusing on either rewards or punishments. Are you dangling that carrot, or are you getting them motivated by sort of whipping them from behind with that stick? You're not doing the right thing. Come on, try harder. It's a very transactional style of leadership. And then on the other side, here we've got passive avoidant leadership. And again, we can break this down even further. So management by exception is all about fighting fires. These leaders are a bit hands-off until there's a problem, and then they jump in and they solve the problem and fight the fire. So basically, we could say they lack engagement unless there's a problem to solve. And then there's laissez-faire. Now, laissez-faire leaders really don't want to be involved at all. They avoid involvement at all costs. Have a think about whether you've had experience with any of these kind of leaders in your past. They're not necessarily bad forms in themselves, right? Sometimes they can work well in certain contexts. You know, you might find that achievements and rewards could be good, but it's really thinking about what situations are better for what kinds of leadership style, and what am I personally most suited to? So these forms of leadership can definitely be useful in areas, but transformational leadership tends to be much more functional and lead to higher levels of performance and engagement. If we think of these leadership styles in terms of effectiveness versus ineffectiveness and active versus passive styles, then this diagram here really lays it out simply. Transformational approaches tend to be the most effective and the most active styles of leadership. And there's lots of research to support this. If you're interested in looking this up for yourself, I really encourage you to. So here's something to reflect on. Where are you experienced in the 5 I's? And thinking about those 5 I's, ask yourself, how does my behavior show up to others? Which of these 5 might I need to focus on and develop a little bit more if I want my leadership to be more effective? This would be something really good for you guys to reflect on, and maybe focus on this through your leadership practice if there's just one of these that you might want to focus on. Now, another important aspect I want to look at today are cognitive approaches to leadership. Here, we're focusing on the cognition or the thoughts that leaders have that can support them in their leadership approaches. So these approaches are concerned with how leaders and followers think and process information. And these include important topics like self-concept, that is, how I see myself as a leader, the version of you that you hold of yourself to be true. And then metacognition, the thoughts that you have about your thinking and the patterns of thoughts that you can see. And then finally, what we tapped into at the start of this seminar, that idea of our implicit leadership theory, what we personally think leadership is, and how those beliefs around leadership inform our own behaviors. So cognitive models of leadership tend to work like this. The leader completes some actions in order to create follower behavior or to impact followers. The leader has certain values. This is what is important to me. And they have a self-concept. This is who I think I am. What they do is make salient their values to motivate others. That is, they ensure that their values are well understood and then use these to motivate others around them. This is important because how well you know your own values is directly related to how much you can make them salient. Salient just means important, showing up for other people. So for me as a coach, trust, personal responsibility, reflection, growth, and development, all of those are super important for me, and they relate to what I do. And as such, they can become inspiring for other people around me. So we make salient our values to motivate other people. We talk about what we're most passionate about, and that helps create follower behavior. Then, as leaders, we enact our self-concept to relate to others. So if I think of myself as a leader in a certain way, and I hold an understanding of what my values are, then I choose to enact that in how I'm interacting with others. So I hold myself accountable to my values being exhibited in how I show up every day. So we have our cognitions, how we think about ourselves, and what we think about leadership. We identify the values associated with them, and then this impacts others in particular ways. It doesn't necessarily lead to positive outcomes for them, which is why it's really important for us to reflect on our values, our self-concept, and how these are affecting those people around us. So how do we work with this within the leadership context specifically? So this idea of a working self-concept is really important in this space. Some of us might hold the assumption that we're born and we show up based on our genetics, and that's it. But we actually know from research that that's only part of the story. That's not the whole story. How we show up in the world is created and constantly evolving. And this is same for our self-views. What we think of ourselves is constantly evolving. If my view of myself is too rigid and not open to adaptation, then it limits my possibilities of who I can become. So we may have some core ideals that show up in different areas of our lives as we grow, but self is a changing process. We learn and we become as we grow, as we move through the world. And as we have different experiences, we might start to question our self-view, how we look at ourselves, in order to help us decide to become a better person, the person we actually want to be. So we may go through periods of our lives where we put forward narratives of ourselves that say, okay, these are my values, and this is what's important to me. But with true, deep self-reflection, we might start to notice that actually we're not showing up that way. We might notice inconsistency with the way we think we're showing up and how others are actually experiencing us. It's like the person who says that they really value loyalty and then they cheat on their partner, or the person who really values health and then sort of lives in a lifestyle that doesn't actually show that. In leadership, it's the leader that values an open door policy and then is always too busy to actually speak to you. So it takes a lot of self-reflective effort to notice that disparity. And when we do notice it, then we have a choice. We change our behavior, or we change our self-view, our understanding of who we think we are. So this chapter by Lord and Brown, and I'll chuck a PDF of this book chapter up if you're interested. I'll put that up in this week's resources. They also talk about this idea of possible selves, in that we can have different versions of us that show up in different areas of our lives. And by understanding who we possibly could be, depending on different scenarios, that gives us options and choices about how we enact our values and how our worldview in different situations for our own benefit and the benefit of others. It's very valuable for leadership because it can buffer that ambiguity that often comes up with leadership. It's an easy excuse to say, no, sorry, that's just who I am. If people can't hack it, right, they need to get out of the kitchen. This is how I've always been. That's the authentic me. Ugh, when I hear that, I tell you what. Well, the experience that you choose to engage with shape who you are, and how you choose to think also changes that. With deep enough self-reflection, you can choose who you become to a certain degree by the thoughts you have about yourself and the experiences that you choose to set up for yourself. And this course is part of that process, right? You're going to learn about leadership. You're going to learn to enact some leadership behaviors, and you're going to choose to reflect on those in certain ways. The effort you put into this determines the beginning of a pathway to becoming the leader that you want to be, rather than just letting it happen and sort of stumbling through by accident. So now we've got a bit more understanding of the importance of being able to identify our values and helping others to do that too. If you start to get more clarity around who you are now and who you want to become, this will help you be conscious of the thoughts and behaviors that you enact, which in turn will help you generate that chosen sense of self. You'll notice inconsistencies. That's fine, that's human, because you'll be able to rectify them. We're also going to be able to be more flexible in our self-concept and be able to show up in the most effective way depending on what the situation requires of us. And this is a constant process of increasing self-awareness and interaction with our environment. There's no end point. It continues over the lifespan. Now, in regard to this cognitive model of leadership, here are some questions for your own reflection. What drives you? What are your core values? What's your why in terms of leadership? Really importantly, what type of leader do you want to become? These are really important things for you to think about, reflect on, put them in your journal, etc. So the last area we're going to look at is something called complexity leadership. So the cognitive and behavioral approaches that we've looked at today focus on what a leader thinks and what a leader does, and how this impacts who you are and how you express yourself as a leader. All really important stuff. Complexity leadership is a bit more complicated. It integrates the environment and the system into this picture rather than just focusing on the individual. Now, there's a saying that was put forward by a colleague of ours in coaching psychology. The quality of the conversation determines the quality of the relationship. And the quality of the relationship determines the quality of the organization. And this could be any organization or system. It could be a family system, a community, a university, a hosting group. All of these things can be thought of as organizations. Within this simple idea is the assumption that anyone can be a leader and have immense impact on the nature of an organization, depending on the quality of conversation that they're a part of. So here, leadership is not a position, but it's a process of interaction. It means that everyone has an opportunity to lead in every single situation, depending on how they choose to show up and interact and communicate with others. It's about how they build relationships that lead to effective adaptations or outcomes in some way. And this is a core premise of complexity leadership. So the complexity leadership model sees leadership as existing everywhere, or potentially everywhere. It's not just necessarily embedded in an individual's personality, their behavior, their cognition, but leadership exists within that interaction. Now, some research has been done into this form of leadership, and here are some key points that I'll run you through. So leadership can be enacted through any interaction in an organization. Leadership occurs when agent interaction changes expectations of future interactions. In other words, if you, as an agent, do something that leads to a different expectation about the future. So for example, let's say during a meeting, someone just got up and started yelling for no reason at all. That would change expectations of future interactions. People start to worry, right? They feel tense whenever that person's in the meeting. It has a ripple effect on their perspectives on that person, on their perspective on meeting. The idea here is that this form of interaction is actually a form of leadership because it changed the system. Now, that doesn't mean it's effective leadership. Effective leadership occurs when these changes lead to increased fitness of the system in this context or environment. So leadership here is about adaptive challenge or a need for adaptation. And then leadership, if it makes the system more effective to survive, is considered to be effective leadership. Now, the thing about complexity theory is that we don't know what the new patterns will be. We can't predict the future. We can have some sort of understanding of what direction we might be headed in, but we can't completely control the outcome. There are just simply too many variables. The key idea here is that we're thinking about leadership versus individual leaders. That is, we're looking at the process of leadership rather than individual leaders. And this process of leadership is contextual. It happens within context, not on its own, not as a trait, not as a single behavior. Now, what it does is it takes leadership out of a formal position and makes it more about interaction on a day-to-day basis. And there are two key points I want you to take from this. Firstly, that leadership can happen anywhere, at any time, in the system. You do not have to be the CEO to have a positive ripple effect in an organization. Let me ask you this. Who's the most influential person of the 21st century? Who comes to mind for you? If you want to put it in the chat, you can, or you can just think about it. Up to you. Now, I would say that if you doubt that a single person can impact the larger system in any meaningful way, let's consider that the answer to this question might well be patient zero of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're not famous. Indeed, we don't even know who they are, but their interaction with others unknowingly had the greatest impact on global economies, politics, housing markets, the way of working. We're all on Zoom here together because of that person, than anyone else yet this century. Now, this obviously is not the best example for positive or effective leadership, but the point here is that it does illustrate the principles of chaos and systems theory, and that we do not have to be in an obvious position of leadership to have impact on the system. Now, interestingly, these ideas also take away the need for control, which can itself be very limiting, and it gives us a bit more freedom around where we choose to lead from. One of my favorite quotes at the moment is from social scientist Brian Clark, and this is from his book called Fluke. The quote is, "We control nothing, but influence everything." It's a great book. I highly recommend it if you've got time, or if you listen to audiobooks, there's a really good version on there too. So I want you to reflect on this idea of showing leadership in every single interaction, every single form of interaction, and just think about these questions. How do I choose to interact? I want you to think about even this via emails, even in reaching out to your teachers and your lecturers, even in reaching out to each other. How do I choose to interact? How am I leading myself? What options are there for me to provide leadership in interaction with others? And how can I show leadership in what I do every day, no matter what my position is? And I think those are some really important questions to be considering. Now, don't worry, all these slides are going to go up on Canvas. So if you're missing any of these questions, they will be there. Let's talk about your reflective homework this weekend. And it can be ongoing, really. I'd love it to be ongoing. This course is designed for self-reflection to help you think about the bigger perspective of leadership and to learn and grow throughout that process. If you really dig into the reflective process of this, you'll change how you think about yourself generally and as a leader. You'll open up different pathways to the type of leader that you could become. So previously, organizations have focused wholly on this idea of command and control leadership. If I do the best job and everyone does what I say, then things will work out, right? We know that does not work. We know it doesn't work. Organizations are just far too complex for these days. We need to start developing different leaders to lead organizations and communities and countries into the future, given the current tensions and complexities that we're all facing. So with that in mind, it's important for you to spend time identifying and reflecting on your experience of leadership. What behaviors and values represent the type of leader you want to become? What small changes can you make? If you're thinking of just taking one step closer to your version of being the ideal leader, what's a tiny step that you could take? What will it look like, feel like, be like when you get there, when you become that leader? And really important coaching question, how will you measure your progress? How can you make sure that you're constantly reflecting to ensure that you can tell if you're progressing or not? What feedback mechanisms could you put in place? One more thing before I hand over to my very patient and wonderful hosting team. I want to invite you all to an event that's happening Tuesday, the 11th of March at the Seymour Center. So I run another subject called Design Your Future, and we have a very large event happening there. And you'll have the opportunity to hear from several amazing speakers who are going to be talking about how they design their own futures. Afterwards, there's some food provided, so you can just come for a free lunch if you want. And also some really nice opportunity to connect with the speakers, to connect with other students, to connect with me. I'll be there. So it's going to be a really inspiring event. Last year was amazing. Although you're not in that course, I really wanted to give you the chance to be there. So you can register at this QR code. It's completely free. There's a link in these, which you'll need to wait for the slides to go up. You can use that. So please do feel free to do that if you would like. If you do come, please come early. Make sure you're at the registration point just after 9 or at the latest 9:15, because we have around 500 people to register and get them seated as quickly as possible. So try and get there early. The event's going to start at 9:30 sharp and it's going to be recorded. So you need to be there when it starts. If you can make it, I would really love for you to join. And don't forget to come up and say hi if you see me there, if you can make it. That would be so fantastic. So that's it from me. I want to hand you back over to the incredibly patient and wonderful hosting team. I will stop my share and hand back to you guys. Oh, look at that. We've got 10 minutes left. Woohoo!
My God, thank you so much, Renee, for sharing your insights and experience with us today. We now open the floor for questions, so feel free to raise your hand or type your questions into the chat box. Thank you.
So we've already received quite a few questions during the seminar. Thank you again, Dr. Renee. But I'll start off with a question from Vicky. What are some ways that we can learn more about our self-concept without asking straightforward questions to our peers?
Yeah, I think that's great. And it would actually be more about self-concept is more how we think of ourselves than how other people might think that we think about ourselves. So our self-concept is really who we think we are. And I would encourage you to have a look at this book chapter that I'm going to post, which has some fantastic explanations of self-concept generally. And I would get you to just be really thinking about those questions, particularly the implicit leadership theory that you hold. So all those photos that I flashed up before of all those different leaders, look down at your notes and what do you notice? What are you noticing about the implicit leadership theory that you have? Because that's going to actually really connect to your self-concept as well. Reflecting is the absolute key to tapping into our self-concept and being able to understand who we think we are. You can also think back to previous leadership experiences that you've had and think about, how do I see myself as a leader? How do I see myself showing up? And what are my values? What's important to me? And that's when we can start reflecting on, well, am I actually living to those values? Am I demonstrating them, or is there a bit of a mismatch there? So great question. Thanks, Hannah.
We also had another question from Sophie, and the question was, is there any research on leaders who might be quote unquote Nepo babies and their propensity for leadership?
Nepo babies. What's a Nepo baby?
Well, pretty much nepotism, yeah, like someone that's got into a certain role because of nepotism.
What a great question. I don't know. I would love you to have a look. I mean, you have at your fingertips the largest library in the Southern Hemisphere. So go out, whoever asked that question, have a look and post it on a discussion board, because I think that's a fantastic idea. There is so much research on various aspects of leadership, good and bad. And I would really encourage you guys to dive into that, whichever area is interesting to you. Jump into the library and have a swim in it.
Lovely, thanks.
So Renee, Dio Lin has asked, are any examples of successful laissez-faire leadership and why it was successful?
That's a great question. I'm sure there are examples of it being successful. It really depends on the context. So in some situations, being very hands-off can be really useful. Oftentimes, that's going to be within the role. So I think that for me, laissez-faire to work effectively is when it's done with the intention of building agency and autonomy in others. In other words, I'm not ignoring you, but I am enabling you to take ownership of the task yourself. So if we look at it at the exact opposite of micromanaging, which doesn't engender autonomy or agency in anybody, because I'm telling you everything to do, and so you never have to make decisions, that's not very healthy, right? So if your entire approach is laissez-faire and you're completely hands-off, obviously that can be problematic. And I think you'd be hard pushed to find an example where that's successful across the board from start to finish. But folding more of a hands-off approach within to your leadership as part of a multi-faceted approach absolutely could be very, very useful.
All right, Renee, thanks. That was a great answer.
Thanks, Mahia.
We still have some more questions. So
Great.
Declan asks that you mentioned that there was like 5 eyes, but sometimes 4. So the question is, I was wondering which eyes were excluded and like why were they excluded? Like why do we have 5 when it was 4 before?
That's a great question. There are just my understanding is that sometimes people just remove one in order to simplify it. What you'll find with leadership models is that there are so many, so many, and people are constantly, for good or ill, packaging them up to kind of sell them as their own or present them as their own, and that can work really well. But generally speaking, within the academic fields, when we're studying the 5 eyes, we're looking at 5. You'll usually find if we're presenting 4, it would probably be more in the corporate sector. And it could just be removing one in order to simplify the model.
So this question isn't from anyone in the chat. This was pretty much just from the hosting group. Someone in the hosting group had these questions. So the question is, as a leader, you are usually expected to guide people or provide them with some form of wisdom. So how do you handle that pressure that comes with your influence as a leader?
How does a leader handle the pressure of
Yep.
providing wisdom?
Yes.
Okay, is that a question for me or for the group?
It was from the group to you.
For me. Okay, well, that's a great question. As a coach, I would say that's going to depend entirely on the individual. There's never a one-size-fits-all response to how a leader will handle a particular scenario or event. And that's simply because all leaders have completely different strengths and values and, for want of a better word, personalities, different ways of approaching leadership. So for somebody who really values a love of learning, they're going to lean into the process of researching and reading and learning and then be able to rely on that to provide wisdom. Somebody who doesn't so much love that may struggle a little bit more with that, but they will have other strengths that they could lean on. So as if I was coaching a leader with that very question, how I'm feeling all of this pressure to be wise, the kind of questions that I would be asking them, well, what does wisdom mean to you? When have you felt wise in the past? What's helped, what's inspired you to tap into your own wisdom? What are some other leaders who you see as being wise, and how are they projecting that? So we'd be able to tap into an individual's strengths and resources in order to help them to approach that context individually. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Very welcome. Great question. Any others?
Yeah, so this next question is from Jack. Do you have a favorite example of non-traditional leadership, i.e., not a CEO or manager, but like a more unexpected or maybe unconventional role that ends up in leadership?
That's such a beautiful question, Jack. I don't think I have a favorite, but I just love seeing it show up everywhere. I love seeing it show up in students, to be honest. You know, I've been teaching for 25 years now, and I am blown away by the way that I see leadership showing up by people being really kind to each other, by having very thoughtful interactions that are done through that Five Eyes lens, not trying to benefit myself, not trying to think, how can I get the best marks? How can I get to the top? But being able to zoom out and see a much bigger picture and say, look, this is actually what's important. What's important to me is collaboration, is kindness, is the development of the whole, and how can I help other people in that regard? Those are the things for me that I personally find really inspiring. I find it really inspiring when people are taking a lot of responsibility for their own actions as well, rather than relying on other people. How can I do this? What should I do? Where's it? Just being able to sort of breathe into that anxiety and draw on their own strengths and resources and have that sort of courage to step into that space and figure things out. At the same time, being able to reach out for help when they need to and not being shy to do that. So I don't know if I'm answering your question here. I don't have a particular example, but I'm very much of the mind. This is why my favorite quote is from that Brian Klaas book, that we control nothing but influence everything. I just think that says it beautifully. If you can see that your interactions and communications on the tiniest little daily basis have a ripple effect that go out, if you can start to notice that and really consciously have positive interactions for the benefit of others and living to your own values, that's amazing leadership to me.
So what you're suggesting is like pseudo leadership through initiative is often maybe complementary towards like a job title.
Yeah, I don't believe that leadership comes in a job title. I
Hmm.
think that sometimes, and you know what, I've been loving reading all of your discussion posts about leadership versus management because I think that's such a good question and it's something that comes up so often. For me, the way that I approach leadership is that it's so much more than a position of power. Yes, it feels easier to lead in that. And I absolutely think that every single person within any organization has the capacity for leadership, whether they know they're doing it or not. Every action that we take, every communication that we have is a form of leadership.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Maya.
Thank you everyone for the amazing questions. If you think of any additional questions after today's session, we can always continue the conversation on our Canvas discussion board. And of course, thank you again to Renee and thank you all to your participation today. We look forward to seeing you all at the next seminar, and that's everything from the hosting team.
Great job, hosting team. Thank you so much, guys. You did a fantastic job. I'm just going to press stop on the record and say goodbye to everybody.